"I dream about a curvy woman like you," the mountain man declared to the obese schoolteacher, words that echoed louder than the church bell on a Sunday morning. Out on the frozen frontier, a lonely trapper drags a half-frozen woman from the blizzard into his firelit cabin. But what begins as a rescue quickly turns into something no one in town could have imagined. Whispers spread through the dusty streets, gossip sharper than any knife. The townsfolk sneer, the railroad men circle, and a dangerous agent wants the very land she's building her dream upon. Now, a man who swore off people must stand beside a woman mocked for her size, as flames, betrayal, and faith test everything they hold dear. But hidden in the ashes lies a truth even more powerful than fire. Will a town built on scorn tear them apart? Or can one bold declaration turn shame into strength and loneliness into love? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The afternoon sun had long since disappeared behind thick clouds, leaving only the ghostly white of falling snow. Inside the schoolhouse, Nora Bowers pressed her hands together, trying to warm them after stoking the pot-bellied stove one final time. Her shoulders ached from swinging the axe earlier that morning, but she'd been determined to keep her students warm through their lessons. "Remember to review your multiplication tables," she called out as the children bundled up in wool scarves and mittens. "And stay close to your older siblings on the walk home." Little Sarah Jenkins paused at the door, her blue eyes worried. "Miss Bowers, the snow's getting awful bad. Pa says when it snows like this, folks can get lost between their own barn and house." Nora smoothed the girl's yellow braids. "Don't you fret about me, dear. I'll head straight to my room at Mr. Peterson's store." But as she watched the children disappear into the swirling white, her own concern grew. The storm had worsened considerably since morning. With trembling fingers, she fastened her worn shawl tight around her shoulders. The thin fabric offered little protection against the biting wind, but it was all she had. Her teaching position in Silver Creek hadn't yet provided enough funds for a proper winter coat. Taking a deep breath, Nora stepped out into the storm. The bitter cold struck her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. Snow whipped around her, the wind cutting through her clothes as if they were paper. She could barely see 3 feet ahead. "Lord, guide my steps," she whispered, bowing her head against the wind. The mercantile was only 4 blocks away, but in this weather, it might as well have been miles. She pushed forward, her feet growing heavier with each step. The familiar buildings of Silver Creek had vanished behind a curtain of white, leaving her in a bewildering maze of shadows and snow. Her skirts, sodden with snow, wrapped around her legs like iron chains. A violent shiver racked her body. How long had she been walking? Surely she should have reached the mercantile by now. The cold had worked its way deep into her bones, making it harder and harder to think clearly. "Just keep moving," she muttered through chattering teeth. But her next step found nothing but air. With a startled cry, Nora pitched forward into a deep snowdrift. The shock of cold snow against her face made her gasp. She tried to push herself up, but her arms trembled and gave way. Exhaustion swept over her like a heavy blanket. Maybe if she just rested for a moment, gathered her strength. The snow didn't feel quite so cold anymore. A strange warmth seemed to seep through her body, and her eyelids grew heavy. Luis McGraw urged his packhorse through the deepening snow, his years in the mountains telling him this storm was turning deadly. He'd planned to wait out the weather in his line shack, but something, perhaps the Lord's own nudging, had pushed him to make the dangerous trip down to Silver Creek with his load of pelts. The wind howled around him, but his keen eyes, trained by years of tracking game, caught movement ahead. He pulled his horse to a stop, squinting through the curtain of white. There, a dark shape in the snow that shouldn't be there. Without hesitation, he swung down from his saddle. The snow crunched under his boots as he strode forward, his heart racing when he made out the shape of a woman half buried in the drift. Her skin was pale as the snow itself, her lips taking on a bluish tinge that sent fear shooting through him. "Ma'am?" He touched her shoulder gently, then more urgently when she didn't respond. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" A faint moan was his only answer. Luis recognized her then, the new school teacher who'd arrived in Silver Creek 2 months ago. He'd seen her at church, though he'd kept to his usual place in the back, avoiding the curious stares his presence always drew. There was no time to waste. He shrugged off his heavy buffalo coat and wrapped it around her still form. With gentle care that belied his rough appearance, he lifted her into his arms. She weighed more than he expected, but years of hauling deer carcasses and freight had made him strong. "Hang on, ma'am," he murmured, though he doubted she could hear him. "My cabin's closer than town. We'll get you warm." He managed to mount up with her cradled against his chest, no small feat with her unconscious weight. His cabin was just outside town, a fact he'd always appreciated for the privacy it afforded. Now he was grateful for its proximity as he guided his horse through the blinding snow. The familiar shape of his cabin emerged from the white void like an answer to prayer. Luis didn't bother with the usual care of his mount, simply loosening the cinch before carrying Nora inside. He shouldered the door open, ducking to enter the low doorway. The interior was cold and dark but dry. He laid Nora gently on his narrow bed, then moved with practiced efficiency to build up the fire. Soon flames crackled in the fireplace, casting warm light across the cabin's simple furnishings. A rough-hewn table, a single chair, shelves lined with supplies. Luis turned back to his unexpected guest. She hadn't stirred, and her clothes were soaked through with snow. The proper thing would be to send for the doctor, but in this storm, that wasn't possible. He'd seen enough cases of snow exposure in his years in the mountains to know what needed to be done, proper or not. "Lord, give me wisdom," he prayed softly. Then he began the necessary but uncomfortable task of removing her wet outer garments. He worked with clinical efficiency, keeping her modesty intact as best he could while hanging her dress and petticoats near the fire to dry. He left her in her chemise and drawers, wrapping her in every blanket he owned, including the prized Navajo trading blanket he'd received years ago. As he worked, he couldn't help but notice details about her. The softness of her features, the gentle curves of her figure so different from the angular women of the frontier. He'd heard the cruel whispers in town about her size, but to his eyes she looked like a woman meant for comfort and kindness, not the harsh life of the West. He pushed such thoughts aside. Right now she needed warmth and plenty of it. He set water to heat for tea, then pulled his chair close to the bed to monitor her condition. Her color was still poor, but her breathing had steadied. "Miss Bowers," he called softly, chafing her cold hands between his calloused ones. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, then slowly opened. Confusion filled her green eyes as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. "Where?" "You're safe," Luis assured her, keeping his voice gentle. "I found you in the snow. This is my cabin just outside town. The storm's too bad to go further." She tried to sit up, then fell back with a weak groan. "The children. All safe home by now, I reckon. You were the only fool still out in this weather." The words were gruff, but his tone held no real rebuke. A faint blush colored her cheeks as awareness seemed to return. Her hands clutched at the blankets, and her eyes widened when she realized the state of her dress. "My clothes. Drying by the fire. Had to get you out of them wet things before the cold took you." Luis stood abruptly, moving to check on the heating water. "I'll make you some tea. Need to warm you from the inside, too." He kept his back turned, giving her privacy to process her situation. The wind howled outside, rattling the cabin's windows, but inside, the fire crackled steadily, filling the small space with warmth and the scent of burning pine. "Thank you," Nora said softly. I think you saved my life." Luis grunted, measuring tea leaves into a tin cup. Anyone would have done the same. "No," she said with quiet certainty. "Not everyone would have. I've learned that since coming west." There was a wealth of hurt in those words, though she tried to hide it. He brought her the tea, helping her sit up enough to drink. Her hands shook as she took the cup, and without thinking, he steadied them with his own. For a moment, they both froze at the contact. Then Nora gave him a shy smile that seemed to warm the cabin more than any fire could. "I know who you are," she said. "Mr. McGraw. You sit in the back pew at church. The children point you out sometimes. They say you're a real mountain man who lives all alone and knows the ways of the wild." Luis shifted uncomfortably. "Don't put much stock in town talk, ma'am." "Neither do I. Something in her tone made him look at her sharply. Her eyes held understanding, and he realized she too knew what it was to be the subject of whispers and stares. The tea seemed to revive her somewhat. Color returned to her cheeks and her shivering lessened. Luis busied himself preparing a simple meal of beans and salt pork, aware of her watching him move about the cabin. "You have books," she said suddenly, spotting his small shelf of volumes. "Man can't live on hunting alone." He paused, then admitted, "Like to read when the winter nights get long." "What do you read?" "Bible mostly, some poetry, Shakespeare, when I've a mind to puzzle it out." Her face lit up. "Shakespeare? Which plays?" For the next hour, as the storm raged outside, they talked of literature. Luis found himself sharing thoughts he'd never spoken aloud, and Nora's intelligent observations made him see familiar passages in new ways. She spoke with passion about teaching, about her dreams of opening minds to new ideas, even here on the frontier. He found himself studying her as she talked, noting how animation brought beauty to her face, how her hands moved expressively as she made a point. She was nothing like his late wife. Maria had been as wild and fierce as the mountains themselves. But there was a different kind of strength in Nora, one that came from standing firm in the face of unkindness, from believing in the worth of others even when she doubted her own. The fire's warmth slowly began to seep into the cabin's rough-hewn logs, fighting back the bitter cold that had followed them inside. Luis moved with quiet efficiency, his boots making soft sounds against the wooden floor as he tended to Nora. He'd laid her carefully on his bunk, which was pushed against the far wall, a simple frame holding a straw-filled mattress he'd traded for last summer. His collection of furs, earned through months of careful trapping, now served a better purpose than trade as he layered them over her still form. First, the rabbit pelts, soft as silk, then the thicker deer hides, and finally the heavy bear fur he usually saved for the coldest nights. Each layer he tucked around her with gentle hands that belied their weathered appearance. Nora's face remained pale, her lips holding a concerning bluish tint. Luis knew from harsh experience that cold could kill as surely as any bullet. Without hesitation, he took her small hands between his own rough palms, beginning the careful work of restoring warmth to her frozen fingers. "Easy now," he murmured as he worked, his voice barely louder than the crackling fire. "Got to take it slow. Let the warmth come back natural-like." His calloused thumbs moved in small circles over her knuckles, bringing life back to the cold flesh through patient friction. The wind howled outside like a hungry wolf rattling the single window pane. Inside, the fire popped and hissed, sending sparks up the stone chimney Luis had built with his own hands 3 summers ago. The familiar scents of wood smoke, leather, and pine filled the small space. Nora's eyelids fluttered, then opened slowly. Confusion clouded her green eyes as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. The rough-hewn walls, the simple furnishings, the rack of tools hanging near the door. Her gaze finally settled on Luis, still holding her hands in his own. She tried to speak, but her lips trembled too much to form words. Fear flashed across her face as she attempted to sit up, but weakness kept her pressed against the thin pillow. "You're safe, Miss Bowers," Luis said quietly, keeping his voice steady and calm. "Found you in the snow, brought you to my cabin. Storm's still raging something fierce outside, but you're safe here." He continued the gentle motion of his hands around hers, watching as awareness gradually returned to her eyes. The children," she managed to whisper through chattering teeth. "All home safe, I expect. You were the only one still out in that weather." He tried to keep his tone light, though the memory of finding her half-buried in snow made his heart clench. "Reckon they've more sense than their teacher when it comes to blizzards?" A ghost of a smile touched her blue-tinged lips at his gentle teasing. The fear in her eyes began to fade, replaced by exhaustion as the ordeal caught up with her. Luis found himself studying her face, noting how the firelight softened her features, casting warm shadows across her cheeks. Without thinking, without planning, and Lord knew he'd never been one for pretty words, he spoke what was in his heart. "I dream about a curvy woman like you." The words hung in the air between them as startling as a gunshot in a church. Luis felt heat rise to his face that had nothing to do with the fire. He hadn't meant to speak so plain, hadn't meant to speak at all. 5 years of mountain solitude had surely rusted his social graces, what little he'd had to begin with. Nora's eyes widened and a flush of color finally began to return to her cheeks. She stared at him, clearly trying to read his face in the flickering light. Luis could see the thoughts moving behind her eyes, wondering if he was mocking her, like so many others had done since she'd arrived in town. He turned away abruptly, moving to the fireplace to add another log, using the activity to hide his embarrassment. The wood settled with a shower of sparks, and he took longer than necessary arranging it with the poker, keeping his back to her. I'm sorry, ma'am, he said gruffly to the flames. That was forward of me. The cold must have addled my brain some. Behind him, he heard her shift slightly among the firs. Did you mean it? Her voice was small, uncertain, but holding a thread of something that might have been hope. Luis stared into the fire, watching the flames dance. Never been one for lying, he said finally, nor for pretty words neither. But yes, I meant it. He risked a glance over his shoulder. You got a kind of softness. Reminds me of better things than these hard mountains. Nora didn't respond, and when he looked again, he saw that exhaustion had finally claimed her. Her eyes had drifted closed, her breathing evening out into the rhythm of sleep. The flush of returning warmth colored her cheeks now, and her lips had lost their dangerous blue tint. Luis settled into his straight-backed chair, preparing for a long night's vigil. The wind continued its assault outside, but inside, the fire burned steady and warm. He watched Nora sleep, troubled by feelings he thought lumbarinidabra in a grave, alongside Maria and their infant son. The years of solitude had been a comfort after their deaths, a way to wall himself off from the pain of caring for others. But watching Nora's chest rise and fall beneath the firs, he felt those carefully built walls beginning to crack. It frightened him more than any mountain lion or bear ever had. She stirred slightly in her sleep, making a small sound of distress. Without thinking, Luis reached out to adjust the furs more snugly around her shoulders. His hand lingered there for a moment, feeling the soft roundness of her through the blankets. Rest easy, he murmured more to himself than to her. You're safe here. The night settled deeper around the cabin and Luis kept his watch. The fire needed feeding, and he had his own demons to wrestle with. Memories of another night spent watching over loved ones as fever, not cold, stole their lives away. But this night would have a different ending, he determined. This time, he had been quick enough, strong enough, to make a difference. As if in response to his thoughts, Nora sighed in her sleep, turning slightly toward the fire's warmth. A strand of her dark hair had come loose from its pins, curling against her cheek. Luis forced himself to look away, to focus on the practical tasks at hand, keeping the fire fed, checking that her clothes were drying properly, watching for any signs of fever or deeper chill. But his thoughts kept returning to that unguarded moment, to the words that had slipped past his usual careful silence. He couldn't take them back now, didn't even know if he wanted to. All he could do was wait for morning, and hope that, when she woke, she would understand that he had spoken from his heart, however clumsy the words had been. The blizzard raged on outside, but within the cabin's walls a different kind of storm was brewing, one that threatened to shake loose everything Luis had thought he knew about himself and his solitary life in the mountains. Morning crept over the mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold. Inside the cabin, Luis had been up since before dawn, stoking the fire and preparing a simple breakfast. The aroma of strong coffee mingled with the savory smell of venison stew simmering in the iron pot. Nora stirred beneath the firs, her eyes opening to the unfamiliar ceiling. For a moment, confusion crossed her face before memory returned. She sat up slowly, drawing the blankets around her shoulders. "Morning," Luis said quietly, his back to her as he worked at the cook stove. "Coffee's hot if you're feeling up to it." "Thank you," Nora replied, her voice still rough from sleep. She glanced down at her dress, now dry but badly wrinkled. I should get back to town." Luis nodded, though his shoulders tensed slightly. "Reckon so. But not before you eat something." He filled a tin cup with coffee and brought it to her, along with a bowl of steaming stew. Nora accepted both gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. The rich scent of the coffee helped clear her head. "I'm afraid people might talk if I'm not there soon," she said softly, staring into the dark liquid. "People always talk. Luis replied, his voice matter-of-fact. Nature of towns. He settled onto his wooden chair, keeping a respectful distance as she ate. The stew was simple but filling, tender chunks of venison swimming in a rich broth. Nora found herself hungrier than expected, finishing the entire bowl despite her usual habit of eating sparingly in front of others. When she looked up, she caught Luis watching her with something like approval in his eyes. "Much obliged for the meal," she said, setting the empty bowl aside. "And for everything else." Luis just nodded, taking the dishes to his wash basin. "I'll saddle the mule." Safer than walking in all this snow. Outside, the morning air bit sharp and clean. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed into crystalline white. Luis led his mule, a sturdy brown creature named Bess, around to the cabin's front. He helped Nora mount, his hands strong and steady at her waist, then took the lead rope and began walking beside them toward town. The snow crunched beneath their feet and their breath formed clouds in the frigid air. Neither spoke much, but the silence felt comfortable rather than strained. Nora found herself studying Luis as they walked, the way he moved with quiet confidence through the deep snow, the set of his shoulders beneath his worn coat, the profile of his face beneath his wide-brimmed hat. As they approached the outskirts of town, Nora felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. The main street was already busy despite the early hour, and heads turned as they passed. She heard the whispers start, immediately saw the pointing fingers and knowing looks. Outside the general store, a group of women from the church society stood huddled together. Mrs. Whitaker, her thin face pinched with disapproval, raised her voice deliberately. "Well, I never! Spending the night with that wild mountain man. And her a school teacher." "Shameless," agreed Mrs. Peterson, adjusting her bonnet with precise movement. "What kind of example is she setting for our children?" Nora felt her face flame with embarrassment. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, trying to maintain her dignity despite the burning in her cheeks. Luis said nothing, but his jaw tightened as he continued leading the mule forward. A cluster of men lounging outside the saloon added their own cruel commentary. "Hey, McGraw," one called out. "Finally found yourself a woman big enough to keep you warm?" The others guffawed, elbowing each other and making exaggerated gestures. Luis's only response was to move slightly closer to Nora's side, positioning himself between her and their jeers. His silence carried its own kind of dignity, a refusal to engage with their baseness that made the men's laughter sound hollow and mean. When they reached the mercantile, Luis helped Nora down from the mule with the same careful respect he'd shown all morning. His hands lingered for just a moment at her waist, steady and warm through the fabric of her dress. "Thank you," she whispered, not quite meeting his eyes. "I'm sorry about all that." Luis shook his head slightly. "Ain't nothing to be sorry for. You needed help? I helped. Simple as that." He tied Bess to the hitching post and followed Nora into the store. The bell above the door chimed their entrance. And Mr. Jenkins looked up from his ledger. His eyebrows rose at the sight of them together, but he said nothing. Luis moved through the store with purpose, gathering supplies: coffee, flour, salt, ammunition for his rifle. Nora stood near the door, watching as he placed each item on the counter and counted out coins from a leather pouch. His movements were efficient, unhurried, despite the weight of stares from other customers who had wandered in. When he finished his business, Luis touched the brim of his hat to her. "Miss Bowers?" he said simply, then turned and walked out. Nora watched through the window as he untied his mule, loaded his supplies, and headed back toward the mountains. His straight-backed figure grew smaller against the snow until it disappeared around a bend in the road. The rest of the day passed in a blur of whispers and sidelong glances. Nora taught her classes as usual, but she could sense the judgment in the air. Even some of the children seemed different, clearly repeating things they'd heard at home. When school finally ended, she climbed the narrow stairs to her room above the mercantile with leaden feet. The small space felt colder than usual despite the small stove in the corner. Nora changed into her nightdress and knelt beside her narrow bed, clasping her hands together. "Dear Lord," she whispered, "grant me strength to bear their judgment with grace. Help me remember that you see the truth in all hearts." Tears pricked at her eyes as she continued her prayer. The day's humiliation still stung sharply, but beneath it lay a warm current of gratitude. She remembered Luis's quiet dignity, the way he had sheltered her with his presence. No one had ever stood up for her like that before, even without words. "And Lord," she added softly, "thank you for sending someone kind when I needed help most." She paused, then whispered, "Even if others can't see his kindness through their own meanness." Rising from her knees, Nora climbed into bed and pulled the quilt up to her chin. Outside her window, the stars sparkled coldly in the clear night sky. She lay awake for a long time, remembering the warmth of Luis's cabin, the gentle way he had tended to her, the surprising words he had spoken in the firelight. The town's cruel judgment warred with those memories, leaving her heart uncertain. But as sleep finally began to claim her, Nora found herself holding on to the memory of Luis's steady presence beside her on that snowy road, a shield against the world's unkindness. A week after the blizzard, the morning sun cast long shadows across the freshly shoveled path to the schoolhouse. Nora arrived early, stoking the pot-bellied stove until it glowed cherry red. Her breath still fogged in the cold air, but at least the worst of the chill had retreated from the wooden walls. The door creaked open as her students began arriving, each bundled in layers of wool and quilted blankets. Little Sarah Johnson clutched her slate to her chest, her red mittens leaving fuzzy bits on the dark surface. Behind her, the Cooper twins stomped snow from their boots, their faces bright with excitement despite the early hour. "Good morning, children," Nora called out warmly, helping the younger ones unwrap their scarves. "I trust you've all completed your arithmetic?" A chorus of "Yes, Miss Bowers" filled the room, mixed with a few guilty shuffles from those who hadn't. Nora smiled, knowing the cold weather made studying difficult in poorly lit homes. She'd been lenient this past week, understanding how the blizzard had disrupted many families' routines. As the children settled into their seats, a shadow passed by the window. Nora glanced up to see Luis McGraw leading his mule past the schoolhouse, laden with supplies. He slowed his pace, pausing near the window as young Tommy Peters stood to begin his recitation. 4 times 4 is 16, Tommy declared proudly, his voice carrying through the thin walls. 4 times 5 is 20. Nora watched Luis tilt his head, listening. His expression softened as the children's voices rose and fell in their multiplication tables. She hadn't seen him since that morning a week ago, when he'd shielded her from the town's cruel whispers. Her cheeks warmed at the memory. "Miss Bowers?" Sarah raised her hand. "May we sing our alphabet song?" "Of course, dear." Nora moved to the front of the room, conducting with gentle movements as the children's voices lifted in song. Through the window, she saw Luis smile, just a slight upturn of his lips, but it transformed his weathered face. When the morning lessons concluded, Nora dismissed the children for their midday meal. She stepped outside, drawing her shawl tight against the cold. Luis still stood nearby, adjusting the packs on his mule. "Mr. McGraw," she called softly, "I haven't had the chance to thank you properly. For last week." He turned, touching the brim of his hat. "No need for thanks, Miss Bowers." "Would you?" She hesitated, then gathered her courage. "Would you walk with me?" "I'm headed to the church to discuss some matters with Reverend Wilson." Luis nodded, gathering Bess's lead rope. They fell into step together, their boots crunching on the packed snow. The church spire rose ahead of them, its white-painted boards stark against the winter sky. "The children are learning well," Luis commented after a moment. "Heard them reciting." Good, clear voices. Nora beamed at the praise. They're eager to learn. But this little schoolhouse. She sighed, gesturing back at the rough building. "It's too small, too cold. I dream of something better for them." They walked a few more steps before she continued, her voice growing animated. "I've been thinking. There's that beautiful spot down by the river, just past the bend. Imagine a proper school there with big windows to let in the light, and a real foundation to keep out the cold." Luis listened intently as she described her vision. A schoolhouse large enough for twice the current number of students, with shelves for books and maps on the walls. "The children deserve a place where they can truly thrive," she finished, her cheeks pink with enthusiasm. "Reckon they do," Luis agreed quietly. Something in his tone made Nora look at him more closely, But before she could ask what he was thinking, a commotion from the saloon caught their attention. A crowd had gathered outside the swinging doors, surrounding a well-dressed man who stood on the wooden sidewalk. His suit was cut in the latest Eastern style, and his boots showed no sign of trail dust. "Ladies and gentlemen," the man announced, his voice carrying across the street, "allow me to introduce myself. I am Mr. Haldridge, representative of the Western Pacific Railroad Company." The crowd pressed closer, murmuring with interest. Nora and Luis paused at the edge of the gathering, watching as Mr. Haldridge smiled broadly. "I bring excellent news," he continued. "The railroad has chosen your promising town for expansion. We intend to purchase land along the river for new tracks and a proper depot. This will bring unprecedented prosperity to your community." Excited chatter broke out among the townspeople. "A real depot? Think of the business it'll bring. Finally, some progress." Luis's jaw tightened as he listened. His eyes met Nora's, and she saw her own concern reflected there. The river location, Mr. Haldridge described, it was exactly where she'd hoped to build her school. "We'll be negotiating land purchases over the next few weeks," Haldridge announced smoothly. "I encourage all property owners to consider the tremendous opportunities this represents." He stepped down from the sidewalk, moving through the crowd with practiced ease. People pressed forward to shake his hand, eager to curry favor. But when he reached the spot where Nora and Luis stood, he paused, his smile faltering slightly at Luis's steady gaze. "Sir," Haldridge nodded stiffly, then turned to Nora with an oily smile. "Madam, I trust you share your neighbor's enthusiasm for progress?" Before Nora could respond, Luis spoke quietly. "Progress ain't always what it seems, Mr. Haldridge." The railroad agent's eyes narrowed, but his smile remained fixed. "A man of few words, I see. Well, I'm sure we'll have many opportunities to discuss the future of this fine town." He tipped his hat and moved on, already focusing on the next group of eager townspeople. Nora watched him go, her heart heavy. "That land by the river," she said softly. "It's perfect for a school. The children could have a garden in spring, maybe even a proper playground." Luis touched her elbow gently, guiding her away from the crowd. "Don't give up on your dream yet, Miss Bowers. Railroad men make big promises, but they don't always keep them." They resumed their walk toward the church, but Nora's earlier enthusiasm had dimmed. The winter sun seemed colder now, and the snow-covered street stretched before them like an uncertain path into the future. At the church steps, Luis paused. "Thank you for walking with me," Nora said, trying to smile. "And for listening to my dreams, even if they may come to nothing now." "Dreams matter," Luis replied simply, "especially ones that help others grow." He touched his hat again and turned to go, leading Bess back toward the main street where Haldridge's voice could still be heard making grand promises to the assembled crowd. Nora watched him until he disappeared around the corner, then climbed the church steps slowly. She had come to discuss plans for a spring festival with Reverend Wilson, but now her mind was full of competing visions. The school she yearned to build, and the railroad steel tracks cutting through the same peaceful riverside spot. Inside the church, sunlight streamed through the plain glass windows, creating pools of warmth on the wooden floor. Nora paused in the empty sanctuary, gathering her thoughts. The railroad's arrival would change everything, but whether for better or worse remained to be seen. The evening sun cast long shadows across the muddy street as Luis secured his mule behind the saloon. He had meant to head straight back to his cabin after restocking supplies, but something made him linger. Perhaps it was the way Haldridge's promises had rung false, or the worried look in Nora's eyes when she spoke of her school dream. Raised voices from inside the saloon caught his attention. Luis moved closer to the back window, keeping to the shadows. Through the grimy glass, he could make out Haldridge holding court at a corner table, surrounded by rough-looking men who weren't from town. "Gentlemen," Haldridge's smooth voice carried clearly, "persuasion is always our first approach. But some of these simple folk need additional motivation to see reason." He pulled out a thick envelope, sliding it across the table. "That's your first payment. I expect results within the month." One of the men, wearing a gun belt slung low, thumbed through the bills. "What kind of motivation you want, boss?" Haldridge swirled amber liquid in his glass. "Nothing too obvious. Accidents happen after all. especially to stubborn property owners who won't sell, or to those who might rally others against progress. His smile turned cold. Like that schoolteacher woman. She's been filling heads with nonsense about building by the river. Luis's hands tightened into fists. He'd seen men like this before, wolves in fine clothing, using others to do their dirty work. Without a sound, he slipped away from the window and untied his mule. The street was nearly empty as he led Bess toward the mercantile where Nora boarded. The evening air had grown sharp with frost when Luis knocked quietly on the back door of the mercantile. After a moment, Nora appeared, surprise crossing her face. "Mr. McGraw, is everything all right? Need to speak with you," he said softly. "Important?" Nora hesitated only briefly before stepping aside to let him enter. Her small room above the store was modest but neat, with a narrow bed, a rocking chair, and a table barely big enough for two. A lamp burned low and school books were stacked carefully on the windowsill. "I was just about to fix some supper," she said, gesturing to the small stove where a pot simmered. "There's plenty if you'd like to share." Luis removed his hat, holding it between weathered hands. "Much obliged." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Miss Bowers, I heard something tonight, about Holdridge and his plans." As Luis repeated the conversation he'd overheard, Nora sank slowly into her rocking chair. The lamp cast shadows across her face, highlighting the worry in her eyes. "Threats and intimidation," she whispered. "Just to force people from their land?" Her voice trembled slightly. "And he mentioned me specifically?" Luis nodded grimly. "Reckon your school idea troubles him. Competing claim for that riverside plot." Nora stood abruptly, moving to stir the pot on the stove. "I should have known it was foolish, dreaming of building something permanent here. Who am I to stand against the railroad?" Her shoulders slumped. "Just a widow who doesn't fit anywhere trying to do some good?" "Don't talk that way." Luis's voice was quiet but firm. "Your dream ain't foolish, it's worth fighting for." She turned to face him and he saw tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "Would you like some supper, Mr. McGraw? It's only beans and cornbread, but it's hot." "Luis," he said softly. "Reckon you can call me Luis." A small smile touched her lips as she nodded. "Then you must call me Nora." They sat at her small table, the lamp burning low between them. The cornbread was fresh-baked and fragrant, and the beans were well-seasoned. For a while, they ate in comfortable silence, both aware of how strange and yet natural it felt to share this simple meal. "May I ask," Nora ventured finally, "why you came to warn me? Most folks in town barely acknowledge my existence except to whisper about my size or my spinsterhood." Luis set down his spoon, his eyes distant. "Been watching folks suffer under men like Holdridge too long. Seen what happens when nobody stands up." He took a deep breath. "And maybe I've been alone too long myself." "What do you mean?" His voice grew softer, heavy with memory. "Had a family once. Wife, Sarah, and a little girl, Mary, up in the mountains where I trap. Fever took them both one winter. 8 years ago now." He stared down at his rough hands. "Couldn't save them. Been keeping to myself since then. Easier that way. Less chance of losing anyone else." Nora reached across the table, hesitantly touching his arm. "I'm so sorry, Luis." He met her eyes, seeing no pity there, only understanding. "Your turn," he said gently. "Tell me your story." Nora's hand withdrew slowly. "I was married too back east. James was a kind man who saw past." She gestured at herself. "Well, past what others mocked. We had 2 good years before consumption took him." Her voice grew stronger. "I came west to teach because I wanted to make a difference. To show children that worth isn't measured by how you look or where you come from." "You're doing that," Luis said. "Seen it in their faces when they learn something new. Seen how they trust you." "The other women in town say I'll never marry again," Nora continued, a flush rising in her cheeks. "They whisper that no man would want someone like me." "Those women are fools." Luis's voice was gruff with emotion. "True worth ain't about size or looks. It's about heart, about standing up for what's right. He met her gaze steadily. Like you're doing with this school. Silence fell between them, filled with unspoken understanding. The lamp flickered, casting warm light across their faces. Outside, a night wind rattled the window panes. Finally, Luis stood, settling his hat back on his head. Getting late. Should go before folks start talking more than they already do. Nora rose too, walking with him to the door. Thank you, Luis. For the warning, and for everything else. He paused in the doorway, turning to face her. The moonlight silvered his features as he spoke quietly but firmly. I'll stand with you if the time comes, Nora. Whatever Haldridge and his men try, you won't face it alone. Their eyes held for a long moment. Then Luis touched the brim of his hat and slipped away into the darkness, leaving Nora standing in the doorway, her heart full of both fear and hope. She watched until his figure disappeared down the moonlit street, then slowly closed the door. The room felt different now, smaller yet somehow warmer, as if the shared confidences of the evening still lingered in the air. Nora moved to the window, looking out at the sleeping town. Somewhere out there, Haldridge was plotting with his hired men. The threat of violence hung over her dream of a riverside school like a storm cloud. But Luis's words echoed in her mind. I'll stand with you. After so long feeling isolated and judged, the simple promise of alliance meant more than she could express. She extinguished the lamp and prepared for bed, her mind full of the evening's revelations. Luis's story of loss touched her deeply, helping her understand his years of solitude. And he had listened to her own tale without judgment, seeing past the surface to recognize the heart of who she was. As she drifted toward sleep, Nora realized that something had shifted between them tonight. In sharing their wounds and hopes, they had forged a bond stronger than mere friendship. Whatever challenges lay ahead with Haldridge and the railroad, she would face them knowing she was no longer alone. The pale winter sun crept across the schoolroom floor as Nora wrote arithmetic problems on the blackboard. Behind her, the scratch of pencils and occasional whispers filled the air. She smiled, hearing young Tommy helping Sarah with her sums. The children were learning to support each other just as she'd hoped. A familiar creak of boots outside made her heart lift. Right on schedule, Luis appeared at the woodpile, his broad shoulders hunched against the morning chill. Every other day now, he'd been stopping by to chop wood for the schoolhouse stove. The steady rhythm of his axe provided a comforting backdrop to their lessons. During the midday break while the children played in the yard, Nora approached Mrs. Henderson, one of the mothers who had lingered after dropping off her youngest. I've been thinking, Nora began carefully, about the future of our school. These children deserve more than this drafty building. I dream of a proper schoolhouse, down by the river. Now, Miss Bowers, Mrs. Henderson interrupted, her face pinched with concern. That's mighty ambitious talk. We're simple folk here. This schoolhouse has served well enough these past years. Nora pressed on gently. But think of the possibilities. A larger building, proper desks, maybe even a small library. The railroad's coming, Mrs. Henderson said firmly. That's what folks are counting on. Best not to get carried away with dreams that might not fit with progress. She patted Nora's arm with practiced sympathy and hurried away. Nora's shoulders slumped as she watched the woman go. Luis, having finished with the wood, approached quietly. Don't let it trouble you, he said, his voice low. Some folks take time to see past what's familiar. I just wish they could see what I see, Nora replied. The potential in these children, in this community. Luis nodded toward the broken bench in the corner. Mind if I fix that while I'm here? You don't have to. I want to, he said simply, already pulling tools from his coat pocket. As the days passed, Luis's presence became a quiet constant. He mended windows, repaired leaky roof spots, and built new shelves for Nora's precious books. The children grew used to his presence, no longer frightened by his weathered appearance or gruff manner. They would wave to him as they arrived each morning, and he'd touch his hat brim in acknowledgement. Parents began to notice, too. They saw how carefully he tested each repair, ensuring the children's safety. They watched him listen patiently when little Mary proudly read her first sentence, or when Johnny wanted to show him a sum he'd mastered. Gradually, the whispers about the wild mountain man began to shift. One particularly cold Thursday, Mrs. Miller approached Nora after class. "That Mr. McGraw," she said thoughtfully. "He's got a gentle way with the little ones for all his rough looks. Reminded me of how my late father used to be." Nora seized the opening. "He believes in what we're trying to do here, Mrs. Miller. In giving these children the best education possible." Mrs. Miller mused. "Perhaps you could tell me more about this school you've been planning?" Hope bloomed in Nora's chest. It was a small start, but it was something. Sunday arrived crisp and clear. Nora sat in her usual pew, smoothing her best dress nervously. The preacher had asked her to read Psalm 27 during the service, an honor usually reserved for the most respected members of the congregation. Just as the service was beginning, movement at the back caught her eye. Luis slipped in, looking uncomfortable in his cleaned and pressed coat. He took a seat in the last pew, hat held respectfully in his hands. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave her a slight nod of encouragement. Reverend Matthews spoke about courage in the face of trials, his voice rising and falling with practiced rhythm. "The Lord is my light and my salvation," he intoned. "Whom shall I fear?" When it came time for the reading, Nora rose on slightly shaking legs. She made her way to the front, aware of every eye upon her. The Bible felt heavy in her hands as she opened it to the marked page. Her voice trembled on the first line, but as she continued, something shifted. The words seemed to flow through her, carrying their own strength. "Wait on the Lord," she read, her voice growing clear and steady. "Be of good courage, and He shall strengthen thine heart." She felt the congregation's attention deepen, saw heads nodding, noticed Mrs. Henderson dabbing at her eyes. In the back pew, Luis sat perfectly still, his face intent on her words. After the service, people lingered longer than usual, stopping to speak with Nora. Even those who had been coldest to her offered small smiles or nods of acknowledgement. She caught fragments of conversation. "Such feeling in her reading," and "makes you think differently about things." Luis waited until the crowd had thinned before approaching. Snow had begun to fall, adding a hushed quality to the afternoon. "Walk you home?" he asked quietly. They fell into step together, their boots crunching in the fresh snow. The air was still, flakes drifting down in lazy spirals. "Your words in there," Luis said after a while. "They stirred something in me. Something I thought was long dead." He paused, searching for the right words. "Hope, maybe. Or faith. Been so long since I felt either, I nearly forgot what they feel like." Nora glanced at him, touched by his honesty. "Sometimes hope comes back slowly," she said, "like spring after a long winter." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, watching the snow settle on fence posts and windowsills. Children's laughter echoed from somewhere down the street, and the church bells rang out clear and sweet in the winter air. "Feels peaceful," Luis remarked, looking up at the gray sky. "Like the whole world's holding its breath." Nora understood what he meant. In this moment, the struggles with the railroad seemed distant. The judgments and whispers that had plagued her since arriving in town felt less important. Here, walking through the falling snow with Luis beside her, she felt a deep sense of rightness. They reached her door too soon. Luis touched his hat brim in farewell but hesitated before turning away. "Thank you," he said simply, "for reminding me there's still beauty in this world, still things worth believing in." Nora watched him disappear into the swirling snow, his words warming her heart more than any fire could. Perhaps they were both learning to hope again, one small step at a time. Inside her room, she stood at the window, watching the snow transform the town into something pure and new. She thought of the children's eager faces, of Luis's quiet strength, of the softening she'd seen in some of the townspeople's eyes. Change was coming, slow but steady, like the falling snow. And for the first time since arriving in this town, she truly believed her dream of a new school might become reality. The crisp morning air held promise as Nora stood before her class, her excitement barely contained. "Children," she announced, clasping her hands together, "we're going to have a special gathering right here in our schoolhouse. You'll show your parents everything you've learned." Little Mary's hand shot up. "Will we sing, Miss Bowers?" "Yes, indeed. We'll practice our hymns and readings." Nora smiled at the eager faces before her. "And your families will bring food and lanterns to make it a proper celebration." The classroom erupted in chatter. Johnny Thompson, usually so shy, spoke up. "Pa says he knows about building things. Maybe he could help with the new school." "That's exactly what we're hoping for," Nora replied, her heart warming at the children's enthusiasm. Over the next few days, the schoolhouse buzzed with preparation. Children practiced their pieces during lunch breaks, voices lifted in Amazing Grace and Rock of Ages. Even the most restless boys sat still to perfect their reading passages. Word spread through town. Women began stopping by with promises of pies and cakes. Mrs. Henderson, who had been so dismissive before, brought her famous apple pie recipe to share with others. "Might as well do this proper," she said, trying to sound casual. "Can't have folks saying our town doesn't know how to put on a gathering." Luis appeared each day after classes ended, working quietly in the background. He hung pine boughs along the walls, their fresh scent filling the room with Christmas-like cheer. When Nora mentioned needing more lanterns, he disappeared into town and returned with a dozen, carefully cleaning each glass chimney until it sparkled. "You don't have to do all this," Nora told him one afternoon as he mounted brackets for the lanterns. He paused, hammer in hand. "These children deserve their moment to shine." His eyes met hers. "And so do you." The day of the gathering arrived clear and cold. As the sun set, families began arriving, stamping snow from their boots. They carried covered dishes, extra chairs, and lanterns that Luis and some of the fathers hung carefully around the room. The pine boughs cast dancing shadows on the walls as the flames flickered to life. Mrs. Miller arranged pies on a makeshift table, apple, cherry, and wild berry competing for attention. The scent of coffee brewing in huge pots mingled with the pine, creating an atmosphere of warmth and welcome. Children fidgeted in their best clothes, eyes bright with anticipation. Parents filled the benches, some standing along the walls. Even those who had been skeptical of Nora's dreams for a new school couldn't resist their children's excitement. Nora stepped forward, her heart pounding. "Welcome, everyone. These children have worked so hard and they're eager to show you their progress." The program began with the youngest students reciting Bible verses they'd memorized. Little Mary, barely visible over the teacher's desk, spoke clearly. "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." Proud smiles broke out across the room. Mrs. Thompson wiped tears when Johnny stood to read a full paragraph without stumbling once, the same boy who couldn't recognize his letters 3 months ago. The older children presented a geography lesson, pointing out states on the large wall map Luis had repaired. They spoke of rivers and mountains, their knowledge drawing impressed murmurs from the crowd. When the children gathered to sing, their voices filled the schoolhouse with unexpected beauty. Amazing Grace. How sweet the sound. The simple melody carried years of tradition and hope for the future. Parents joined in, the harmony swelling until it seemed the rough walls could barely contain it. During a break for refreshments, Nora noticed small groups forming, voices animated with discussion. Mr. Thompson, Johnny's father, was talking with other men about lumber prices. Mrs. Henderson had cornered the banker's wife, speaking intensely about investment in our children's future. Luis stood near the back as usual, but tonight he wasn't alone. People approached him, asking about the repairs he'd made, commenting on how much stronger the roof seemed now. He answered simply, but openly, no longer the isolated mountain man they'd once feared. Nora made her way to his side. "Would you say something?" she asked softly. "About why this matters?" He stiffened slightly. "I'm not one for speeches." "Just speak from your heart," she encouraged. "They're ready to listen." Luis looked around the room, at the children proudly showing their parents their slate work, at the women sharing recipes and plans, at the men discussing building techniques. Something in his expression shifted. He stepped forward and gradually conversations quieted. Everyone turned to the mountain man they'd once avoided, curious about what he might say. "Wasn't planning to speak tonight," he began, his voice rough but clear. "But looking around this room, I see something important happening." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I've trapped and traded up in these mountains for years, seen folks come and go chasing gold or land or whatever wealth they think will make them happy." The room was completely silent now, every face turned toward him. But education, that's the true wealth of this town, these children. He gestured to where they sat, attentive and still. They're learning more than reading and figures. They're learning to think, to question, to see beyond these mountains. That's wealth no one can take away. Mr. Thompson stepped forward. I've got lumber stored that could start the foundation of a new school. Been saving it for a barn. But this seems more important. I can help with the building, another man called out. Was a carpenter back east? More voices joined in, offering skills, materials, time. The banker's wife whispered something to her husband, who nodded and stood. The bank will match whatever funds the town raises, he announced. Within reason, of course, he added hastily. But he was smiling. Nora stood in the midst of it all, joy making her chest tight. She watched as Mrs. Henderson organized a committee for fundraising, while Mr. Thompson sketched rough building plans on a slate. Children darted between the adults, excitement making them forget their usual shyness. The gathering continued well past its planned ending. No one seemed eager to leave the warmth and promise filling the schoolhouse. Lantern light gleamed on happy faces as people lingered over coffee and pie, making plans and sharing stories. Luis found Nora by the door as families finally began to leave. You did this, he said quietly. You helped them see what was possible. She shook her head, smiling through tears of happiness. We did this. Your words tonight. They touched something in everyone, made them believe. They stood together watching as parents gathered their sleepy children, as women packed up empty pie tins, as men made plans to meet and discuss construction details. The night air was sharp with frost when the last family departed, but inside the schoolhouse hope had bloomed like spring flowers. Reckon this town's changing, Luis observed, helping Nora gather empty coffee cups. For the better, she agreed, her heart full of gratitude and joy. The lamplight caught the pine boughs, making them gleam like promise itself. Tomorrow would bring planning and work. But tonight they had witnessed something remarkable. A community coming together, choosing to believe in something bigger than themselves. They worked in comfortable silence, straightening benches and lowering lanterns. The schoolhouse seemed to hold on to its glow, as if the evening's warmth and fellowship had seeped into its very walls. In every corner, evidence remained of the town's transformation. Building plans sketched on slates, lists of pledged materials, committees formed, and promises made. The night had exceeded Nora's wildest hopes. Her dream of a new school no longer seemed like an impossible fancy, but a goal within reach. And beyond the practical support offered, something even more precious had been achieved. The town had begun to see itself as a true community, united in purpose and pride. Morning sunlight glinted off fresh snow as townspeople went about their usual business. The mercantile's bell chimed cheerfully as customers came and went. Children's laughter echoed from the schoolyard where Nora supervised their morning recess. The peaceful scene shattered when Holdridge's expensive boots stomped up the wooden sidewalk, his face dark with fury. "Where is she?" he demanded, shoving past Mr. Thompson, who was loading supplies into his wagon. The railroad agent's usual polished manner had cracked, revealing the anger beneath. He spotted Nora by the schoolhouse and stalked toward her, his coat flapping in the cold wind. Children stopped their play, sensing trouble. Nora straightened her spine, lifting her chin as he approached. "How dare you organize that gathering without consulting me?" Holdridge's voice carried across the yard. "You've been stirring up trouble, making promises about land that isn't yours to give." Nora shepherded her students toward the schoolhouse door. "Children, inside, please. Miss Martha will lead your arithmetic lesson." She waited until the last child was safely inside before turning to face Holdridge. "That land belongs to the town," she said firmly, though her hands trembled slightly. "The children need a proper school." Holdridge's laugh held no humor. "A proper school? Look around you." He gestured at the muddy street, the simple wooden buildings. "This is a railway town in the making. Progress is coming, whether you like it or not. And progress doesn't wait for the dreams of a fat widow schoolmarm." The cruel words struck like physical blows, but Nora refused to flinch. Several townspeople had stopped to watch, including Mrs. Henderson and the banker's wife. "Mark my words," Holdridge raised his voice, turning to address the growing crowd. "Siding with her and that half-wild trapper will cost you dearly. The railroad brings prosperity, jobs, commerce, connection to the wider world. Are you willing to throw that away for some foolish notion about education? Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Nora saw uncertainty creep into faces that had been so enthusiastic the night before. Mr. Thompson shifted uncomfortably, no longer meeting her eyes. The banker's wife whispered something to her husband, who frowned and shook his head. The railroad has ways of ensuring cooperation, Holdridge continued, his tone silky with threat. Those who stand in the way of progress often find themselves left behind. No trade, no passengers, no mail service. Is that what you want for your town? Fear worked its way through the gathering like poison. People began to drift away, heads down, shoulders hunched. Even Mrs. Henderson, who had been so passionate about fundraising the night before, hurried past without acknowledging Nora. Holdridge smiled, satisfaction clear in his expression. He turned back to Nora. Now then, shall we discuss this reasonably? I have some papers in my office that require your signature. I need to return to my students, Nora said, but Holdridge stepped into her path. The papers can't wait. You've caused enough delay already. His hand closed around her arm, not quite roughly, but with unmistakable force. Let's settle this now. Nora tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. Mr. Holdridge, you're hurting me. Am I? His voice dropped lower. This is nothing compared to what happens to those who oppose the railroad's plans. Think carefully about your next move, Mrs. Bowers. Take your hand off her. The quiet command cut through the tension like a knife. Luis stood at the corner of the schoolhouse, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the snow. No one had heard him approach, but there he was, solid as the mountains themselves. Holdridge's fingers loosened slightly, but he didn't release Nora's arm. This doesn't concern you, McGraw. Go back to your traps and pelts. Luis took one step forward. Just one. But something in his stance made Holdridge step back, finally letting go of Nora. She rubbed her arm, fighting back tears of relief and fear. You're threatening a woman who only wants to help children learn, Luis said, his voice still quiet but carrying clearly in the winter air. Where I come from, that makes it my concern. Where you come from, Holdridge sneered, though he kept his distance. Some cave in the mountains? You're nothing but a savage yourself, barely civilized. What right do you have to interfere with progress? Right? Luis's scarred hands hung loose at his sides, but his eyes never left Holdridge's face. I've watched you strut around this town, making promises and threats. Seen how you look down on honest folks trying to build something real here. You talk about progress, but all I see is greed. A few townspeople had drifted back, drawn by the confrontation. Luis's words seemed to stir something in them. Shame, perhaps, or renewed courage. You can't stop the railroad, Holdridge warned. We're too powerful. This land will be ours one way or another. Maybe so, Luis agreed, but today you're going to walk away, and you're not going to touch her again. Ever. The two men stood locked in silence, measuring each other. Despite his expensive coat and polished boots, Holdridge suddenly seemed smaller next to Luis's weathered strength. Finally, the railroad agent stepped back. This isn't over, he spat. You'll both regret crossing me. He turned sharply and strode away, his boots beating an angry rhythm on the wooden sidewalk. As soon as he was gone, Nora's legs began to shake. Luis steadied her with a gentle hand on her elbow, so different from Holdridge's brutal grip. Are you all right? He asked softly. She nodded, not trusting her voice yet. Together they walked to the schoolhouse steps and sat down. The winter sun had slipped behind clouds, casting everything in shades of gray. You shouldn't have done that, Nora said at last. He'll make trouble for you now. Been dealing with trouble most of my life, Luis replied. One more won't make much difference. But you're trading your livelihood, he could turn people against you. Luis was quiet for a moment, watching his breath make clouds in the cold air. Some things are worth the fight, he said finally. This school, these children, what you're trying to build here. He paused, choosing his words carefully. It matters more than pelts and trading posts. Nora looked at him, really looked at this man who had come down from his solitary mountains to stand beside her. His face was weathered, his clothes rough, but his eyes held a warmth that made her chest ache. They sat in silence, watching shadows lengthen across the snow. Both understood that something had shifted between them, some deeper connection forged in the face of Haldridge's threats. Neither spoke of it directly, but it hung in the air like the promise of spring after a long winter. Inside the schoolhouse, they could hear Miss Martha leading the children in their lessons. Life went on, despite threats and fears. The simple sound of young voices reciting their sums felt like an act of defiance against all that Haldridge represented. "I should get back to them," Nora said eventually, though she made no move to rise. "I'll walk you in," Louise offered. "Make sure everything's secure before dark." They stood together, their shoulders brushing slightly. Both knew that harder days lay ahead, that Haldridge wouldn't give up easily. But in that moment, neither felt alone anymore. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The school teacher and the mountain man standing firm against the tide of false progress that threatened to sweep away everything they held dear. The January wind whistled through the churchyard as men hefted heavy wooden beams into place. Steam rose from their breath in the crisp morning air while they worked to build the new schoolhouse. Though the riverland remained tied up in dispute, Reverend Thompson had offered a patch of ground near the church, and the town had rallied to the cause. "Careful with that crossbeam," Luis called out, his voice carrying over the sound of hammering. His strong arms guided the timber as other men secured it in place. Sweat froze on his brow despite the cold, his shirt sleeves rolled up as he worked. Children darted between the workers, carrying stones from a nearby creek bed for the foundation. Their excited chatter filled the air as they made game of the task, competing to see who could carry the most rocks in their aprons and pockets. "Miss Bowers, look at this one," little Sarah Jenkins held up a smooth gray stone. "It's shaped just like a heart." Nora smiled from where she stood supervising the children's efforts. "That's perfect for our school, Sarah. Every stone you all bring helps build something special." The scent of beef stew and fresh bread wafted across the construction site. Several women had set up a makeshift kitchen, feeding the workers throughout the day. Mrs. Henderson stirred a massive pot while others kneaded dough on portable tables. "Dinner's ready," Mrs. Henderson called out. "Come get it while it's hot." The workers paused gratefully, gathering around the steaming pot with tin cups and bowls. Louise hung back until most had been served, but Nora noticed and brought him a bowl herself. "You need to keep up your strength," she said softly, pressing the warm bowl into his calloused hands. "You've been working harder than anyone." His fingers brushed hers as he took the bowl, sending a flutter through her chest. "Much obliged," he murmured, their eyes meeting briefly before he looked away. As the short winter day faded into dusk, the workers headed home. Nora stayed behind in the partially built structure, setting up her small desk and lamp. Papers scattered across the rough wooden surface as she worked on lesson plans, the lamplight casting a warm glow in the growing darkness. Louise finished securing tools and lumber against the weather, then paused in the doorway. "You ought to head back soon. It's getting cold." "Just a few more minutes," she replied, not looking up from her work. "I want to finish planning tomorrow's geography lesson." Instead of leaving, Louise stepped inside and began stoking up the small stove they'd installed. Soon, warmth began to fill the space. He settled onto a bench nearby, content to wait. The scratch of Nora's pen and the crackle of the fire filled the comfortable silence between them. Finally, she set down her pen and flexed her cramped fingers. "Thank you for waiting," she said, turning to face him. "And for everything else. I never thought we'd get this far with the school." "People respect what you're doing here," Louise replied. "They see how much you care about their children." "Not everyone." Nora's voice held a touch of sadness. "There's still plenty who think I'm just a foolish woman causing trouble. Those people are wrong." Louise's tone was firm. "You give these kids hope. Show them they can be more than what others expect." Nora felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. In the months since that first snowy rescue, Louise had become her strongest supporter, her closest friend. Yet lately, their quiet evening conversations had begun stirring deeper feelings in her heart. "What about you?" she asked carefully. "What do you hope for?" Louise was silent for a long moment, watching the fire's shadows dance on the walls. "Used to be I didn't hope for much of anything. After losing my family." He trailed off, then continued softly. "But lately, I've been thinking maybe there's still good things ahead if I'm brave enough to reach for them." His words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Nora's heart beat faster as she gathered her courage. "You're one of the bravest men I know," she said. "Coming down from your mountain, helping others, standing up to Holdridge. That takes real courage." Luis shook his head. "That's just doing what's right. Real courage is what you show every day. Facing down people's judgment with your head held high, fighting for these kids no matter what anyone says." He met her eyes directly. "You're stronger than anyone I've ever met, Nora Bowers." Color flooded her cheeks at the quiet intensity in his voice. She looked down at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. "I don't feel very strong most times," she whispered. "But you are." His voice was gentle. "Strong enough to change this whole town, bit by bit. Strong enough to make me believe in things I'd given up on." Nora's heart swelled with emotion as she realized the truth. She had fallen in love with this quiet, honorable man. The knowledge both thrilled and frightened her. What if he couldn't see past her size, her plain features? What if he only felt friendship? But when she dared to meet his gaze again, the tenderness she saw there made her breath catch. Here was a man who had seen her heart first, who valued her strength and spirit above all else. Outside, snow began to fall softly in the darkness. The lamp flickered, casting warm light over their faces as they sat in companionable silence, both aware that something precious was growing between them, as steady and sure as the new schoolhouse rising beam by beam. The evening grew later, but neither seemed eager to leave the warmth of the stove and each other's company. Luis added another log to the fire while Nora gathered her papers, moving slowly to prolong their time together. Children's artwork already decorated the half-finished walls, bright drawings of homes and families, dreams sketched in crayon and hope. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges. But for now, in this quiet moment, Nora felt her heart might burst with gratitude and joy. When they finally stepped out into the snowy night, Luis offered his arm to steady her on the slippery path. The simple gesture felt natural, right, like so many things between them had grown to feel. Above them, stars peeked through breaks in the clouds, their light reflecting off the fresh snow and turning the world silver. The town slept peacefully around them as they walked, their footprints marking a path through the pristine snow. Though neither spoke of it aloud, both felt the shift in their relationship, the deepening of friendship into something more precious and profound. The new schoolhouse stood nearly complete against the winter sky. Fresh-cut timber gleamed in the weak sunlight, and glass windows sparkled with promise. Children's artwork already decorated the interior walls, bringing color and life to the space they had all built together. Nora stood in the doorway, breathing in the scent of wood and possibility. Her fingers traced the smooth grain of the doorframe as she mentally arranged desks and teaching materials. Outside, the last of the winter snow was beginning to melt, revealing patches of muddy ground. The sound of approaching horses broke her reverie. Through the morning mist, she saw Mr. Holdridge riding toward the school, flanked by 4 rough-looking men. Their rifles glinted menacingly in their saddle holsters. Her heart began to pound, but she forced herself to stand tall as they dismounted. Holdridge's polished boots squelched in the mud as he approached, a rolled document in his hand. "Miss Bowers," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "I see you've been quite busy with your project." "The children need a proper school," she replied steadily. "The whole town helped build it." "Yes, well," Holdridge unrolled the document. "I have here the final offer from the railroad company. Sign now, and we'll compensate you fairly for the land and this structure. Otherwise," he gestured to his men, who had spread out around the building. Nora's hands trembled, but she clasped them tightly together. "This isn't railroad land, Mr. Holdridge. The town donated this plot near the church specifically for the school. Everything in this valley will be railroad land soon enough." Holdridge's voice hardened. "Sign the papers, or I cannot guarantee the safety of this fine building you've worked so hard to create." "Is that a threat?" Luis's deep voice cut through the tension. He emerged from behind the schoolhouse where he'd been stacking firewood, his axe still in hand. The armed men shifted nervously, but Holdridge merely smiled. "Mr. McGraw still playing protector to our dear schoolmarm, I see. This doesn't concern you." "It concerns the whole town," Luis said, moving to stand beside Nora. "These children need education more than your railroad needs another depot." The men laughed harshly. "Look at the mountain man talking about education," one sneered. "Bet he can't even write his own name." Luis's jaw tightened, but he remained calm. "Leave now," he said quietly. "Before this gets ugly." "Oh, it's already ugly," Holdridge replied. He turned back to Nora. "You have until sunset to sign. After that, well, accidents happen, especially in winter. Stoves can be so dangerous in wooden buildings." Nora felt sick at the implicit threat, but she lifted her chin. "I won't sign." Holdridge's face darkened. "Then you're a fool." He mounted his horse, looking down at them with contempt. "Both of you." With a sharp gesture to his men, they rode away, leaving churned mud and fear in their wake. Luis touched Nora's shoulder gently. "You're shaking." "They're going to destroy it," she whispered. "Everything we've built." "I won't let them," Luis promised. "I'll stay here tonight, keep watch." But even as he spoke, they both knew how vulnerable the wooden structure was. One torch, one accident, and months of work would vanish in flames. The day passed in tense anticipation. Nora taught her lessons as usual, but her eyes kept straying to the windows, watching for riders. As darkness fell, heavy snow began to fall, reducing visibility to mere feet. Luis insisted on staying at the school, despite Nora's protests about the cold. "Go rest," he told her. "I'll wake you if anything happens." Reluctantly, she returned to her boarding room, but sleep eluded her. Every creak and whisper of wind made her start, imagining the worst. Near midnight, shouts and the orange glow of fire jerked her from her uneasy doze. Heart pounding, she threw on her coat and ran into the snowy night. The schoolhouse was already engulfed in flames. Fire licked up the walls and through the windows, consuming the fresh timber like kindling. Through the smoke and snow, she saw Luis fighting to break down the door. "The books," he shouted when he saw her. "Help me save what we can." Together they plunged into the burning building. Heat seared their lungs as they grabbed armfuls of primers, readers, and children's precious artwork. Smoke stung their eyes as they staggered back outside. "One more time," Luis gasped, turning back toward the inferno. "Luis, no." Nora grabbed his arm. "It's too late." As if to prove her words, the roof groaned and began to collapse. Luis pulled her back just as burning timbers crashed down where they had been standing. They could only watch helplessly as flames devoured their dreams. The commotion had awakened the town. People emerged from their homes, but no one moved to help. They stood in silent witness as the fire raged, perhaps afraid of Holdridge's men who might still be watching from the shadows. Nora sank to her knees in the snow, clutching a singed primer to her chest. Tears froze on her cheeks as she watched months of work and hope turn to ash. Luis's earlier words about her strength seemed like cruel mockery now. She had failed. Failed the children, failed the town, failed herself. Beside her, Luis's breathing was labored from smoke and exertion. His coat sleeve was burned, revealing angry red skin beneath, but his eyes blazed with an intensity that matched the flames as he helped her to her feet. "This isn't over," he said firmly, his voice rough. "We'll rebuild. Stronger this time." But Nora could barely hear him through her grief. The fire's heat dried her tears, but couldn't touch the cold despair in her heart. All around them, the heavy snow continued to fall, as if nature itself were trying to extinguish the last embers of her dream. Luis's strong arms supported her as they watched the fire burn itself out, leaving only blackened timbers and ash. The children's artwork, their books, their hopes, all gone in a night of senseless destruction. The snow would cover the ruins, but nothing could hide the wound inflicted on the community's spirit. Dawn broke gray and cheerless over the smoking remains of the schoolhouse. Luis stood guard through the night, his burned arm cradled against his chest, watching for any return of Holdridge's men. But they had done their work and vanished like smoke into the darkness, leaving devastation in their wake. The townspeople began to gather as morning light revealed the full extent of the destruction. Mothers held their children close as they stared at the ruined school. Men shook their heads and muttered about the railroad's power. The message was clear. Progress could not be stopped, no matter the cost to the community. Nora moved like a ghost through the ashes, picking up charred fragments of books and drawings. Each piece represented a child's dream, a lesson planned, a future imagined. Now they crumbled at her touch, as fragile as her own broken heart. Luis watched her with pain in his eyes, his earlier confidence replaced by quiet fury. His burned arm would heal, but the wound to Nora's spirit ran deeper. He had promised to protect her dream, and he had failed. Yet, as he looked at the destruction around them, his determination hardened into steel. This would not be the end of their story. The morning after the fire dawned cold and gray. Smoke still curled from the blackened ruins of the schoolhouse, a stark reminder of the violence that had shattered the town's peace. The fresh snow that had fallen through the night couldn't quite cover the charred timbers and scattered debris. Parents kept their children home, afraid of what might happen next. The usual morning bustle of Main Street was subdued, with townsfolk hurrying about their business, heads down, avoiding each other's eyes. Outside the mercantile, two women whispered together, casting fearful glances toward the railroad office. "No sense fighting progress," one man declared loudly in front of the saloon. "Railroad's coming whether we like it or not. Best just accept it." Others nodded in agreement, their faces grim. "Ain't worth getting our buildings burned down over," another added. Or worse. Inside her small boarding room above the mercantile, Nora sat motionless at her tiny desk. The singed primer she'd salvaged from the fire lay before her, its pages warped and stained with smoke. Her fingers traced the damaged spine, remembering how proudly the children had carried their books each day. Tears welled in her eyes for the 100th time since dawn. "Lord," she whispered, "I thought I was doing your work. Building something good for these children." Her voice caught. Was I just being prideful? Thinking I could stand against men like Haldridge? She thought of Luis, how he'd risked himself trying to save what they could from the flames. His burned arm would take weeks to heal properly. The guilt of it crushed her spirit further. She'd drawn him into the fight, disturbed his solitary peace, and now he'd been hurt because of her stubborn dream. "I should never have involved him," she murmured, dabbing at her eyes with her handkerchief. "He was content in his mountain life before I came along." The memory of his quiet strength through all their trials only made her heart ache more. She'd come to depend on his steady presence, his unfailing support. But she couldn't bear the thought of him suffering further because of her. Kneeling beside her narrow bed, Nora bowed her head. "Please, Lord," she prayed through her tears, "show me the right path. Give me wisdom to know if I should continue this fight or accept defeat gracefully." Her shoulders shook with quiet sobs. "And please protect Luis from any more harm on my account." Meanwhile, in his cabin outside town, Luis sat before his fireplace, carefully applying salve to his burned forearm. The pain was fierce, but he barely noticed it. His thoughts were consumed with darker concerns. The familiar walls of his cabin, once a comfort in their solitude, now felt like a prison of indecision. He'd spent years here, healing from the loss of his family, finding peace in the rhythm of trapping and trading. It had been simple, safe. But now, Luis flexed his injured arm, wincing. Now everything had changed. Haldridge and his men had shown they were willing to use violence. What would stop them from burning other buildings? Or worse, his old instincts urged him to pack his gear and head deep into the mountains. He knew trails where no railroad man could follow, valleys where he could wait out this storm in safety. The temptation pulled at him like a physical force. Yet every time he considered leaving, Nora's face appeared in his mind. Her quiet dignity in the face of mockery, her gentle patience with the children, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke of her dreams for the school. Luis stood and paced the cabin, his boots scuffing against the wooden floor. The walls seemed to close in around him. Outside, the wind moaned through the pines, calling him to the high country where life was simpler. But was simple the same as right? He paused at his window, staring toward town. Smoke still rose from the schoolhouse ruins. The sight stirred something deep in his chest, not just anger at the destruction, but a fiercer emotion he'd thought long buried. Luis remembered the night he'd found Nora in the snow, how fragile yet determined she'd seemed. She'd brought something back to life in him, something he'd thought died with his family years ago. The ability to care, to hope, to fight for something bigger than himself. "Can't run this time," he muttered, his voice rough in the cabin's silence. "Not from this." The decision, once made, settled into his bones with the weight of truth. He might be more comfortable alone in the mountains, But comfort wasn't what God called people to. Sometimes he called them to stand firm, to protect others, to fight for what was right. Luis gathered his coat and hat. His burned arm protested as he pulled on his gloves, but he ignored the pain. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of gold and purple. He had to see Nora before full dark. The walk to town gave him time to order his thoughts. He couldn't let her withdraw into shame and defeat. Her dream for the school wasn't just about a building. It was about giving these children a future brighter than their parents had known. That was worth fighting for. As he approached the mercantile, lights glowed in the upstairs windows where Nora boarded. Luis climbed the external stairs slowly, mindful of the ice. At her door, he paused, hearing quiet sobs from within. His heart clenched at the sound. Taking a deep breath, he knocked gently. "Who is it?" Nora's voice was muffled, thick with tears. "It's Luis." A long pause followed. He heard movement inside, then the door opened slightly. Nora stood there, her eyes red and swollen, her normally neat hair coming loose from its pins. She looked small and vulnerable in the dim hallway. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly. "Your arm needs rest. My arm will heal." Luis kept his voice gentle but firm. "May I come in? We need to talk." Nora hesitated, then stepped back, allowing him inside. Her small room was neat but sparse, a narrow bed, a desk, a chair, and a trunk containing her few possessions. A Bible lay open on the desk beside the damaged primer. "I'm so sorry," she began, wringing her hands. "Your injury, the destruction, it's all my fault. I never should have—" "Stop." Luis held up his hand. "You're not responsible for what those men did. Their choices are their own. But if I hadn't been so stubborn about the school, then the children would have no one fighting for their future." Luis stepped closer, his eyes intent on her face. "You showed this town something important, Nora. You showed them that one person with faith and courage can make a difference." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. What difference? The school is gone. The townspeople are afraid. Everything I worked for is in ashes. Buildings can be rebuilt. Luis's voice grew passionate. But the spirit you put into those children, that can't be burned away. The hope you gave their parents can't be destroyed by men like Haldridge. Nora sank into her chair, looking up at him with wounded eyes. "I don't have the strength to start over. And I can't ask you to risk more for my foolish dreams." "They're not foolish." Luis knelt beside her chair, ignoring the protest from his burned arm. "And you're stronger than you know." He took her hand in his good one, his rough fingers gentle against her soft palm. "Remember what you read in church? About having courage in trials?" She nodded slowly. "The psalm about God being our refuge and strength." "You helped me find faith again," Luis said quietly. "After my family died, I thought God had abandoned me. But seeing your dedication, your kindness, it woke something in me I thought was dead forever." Nora's fingers tightened around his. "I've been praying for guidance," she whispered, "asking God to show me if I should give up. Maybe he sent me instead." Luis managed a small smile. "To remind you that you're not alone in this fight." Fresh tears welled in her eyes, but these seemed different from her earlier ones. "You're not going back to the mountains?" He shook his head firmly. "My place is here now. If you're willing to keep fighting for these children, I'm standing with you, no matter what comes." Nora's face transformed as hope slowly rekindled in her eyes. She straightened in her chair, squaring her shoulders. "It won't be easy," she warned. "Haldridge won't give up. Neither will we." Luis stood, still holding her hand. "God didn't bring us together just to see us surrender to men like him." A ghost of her old smile touched Nora's lips. "You sound very certain about God's plans." "I'm certain about you," Luis replied simply. "Your strength, your faith, your love for these children. That's all I need to know." They stood together in the gathering darkness, their joined hands a promise stronger than words. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving a pristine stillness over the snow-covered town. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight. But tonight, in this small room above the mercantile, hope had begun to bloom again from the ashes of despair. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow as Luis trudged through town. his arms laden with salvaged pine boards from the ruined schoolhouse. Each step sent a twinge through his burned arm, but he pressed on, determination set in his weathered features. The wooden planks still smelled of smoke, yet they remained solid, a reminder that not everything was lost. He climbed the stairs to Nora's boarding room carefully, the boards balanced against his good shoulder. His knock was gentle but firm. "Just a moment," Nora called from inside. When she opened the door, her eyes widened at the sight of the lumber. "Luis? What are you doing?" "Your arm." "Is healing fine?" he finished, stepping inside as she made way. He propped the boards carefully against her wall. "Found these in the ruins? Good wood, barely touched by the fire. Thought you might want to save them for the next school." Nora's face fell. "Next school? After what happened?" She turned away, moving to straighten papers on her small desk. "Maybe it's better to accept defeat. The railroad's too powerful." Luis crossed to her desk in 3 long strides. "Look at me, Nora." She raised her eyes reluctantly to meet his steady gaze. "You've never been one to give up," he said softly. "Not when the town mocked you. Not when the winter nearly took you. Not when those children needed you." "This is different," she whispered. "I can't fight Haldridge alone." "You won't be alone." Luis's voice grew passionate. "That's what I came to tell you. We need to face him together. Not just you and me, but the whole town." Nora shook her head. "The townspeople are scared. They won't stand against the railroad." "They might if we remind them what's at stake." Luis picked up one of the children's primers from her desk, its edges singed, but its pages still intact. "Remember little Sarah Jenkins? How she couldn't read a word when she first came, and now she reads Bible verses to her ma." A small smile touched Nora's lips. She's so proud of herself. "And Tommy Wilson? The boy who thought he'd never be more than a stable hand until you taught him figures?" Luis set the primer down gently. "These children believe in you, Nora. They deserve someone who believes in them just as strong." Tears welled in Nora's eyes, but these were different from her earlier ones. Tears of remembrance and purpose rather than defeat. "The children," she murmured. "They've come so far." "They have." Luis stepped closer, his voice low and intense. "And they need their teacher to show them that justice is worth fighting for. That standing up to bullies like Haldridge is right, even when it's hard." Nora dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief. "But how? How do we convince people to stand with us?" "We talk to them, one family at a time." Luis's eyes sparked with determination. "We remind them what this town could be, not just a railroad stop, but a place where their children can grow into something more." Hope began to kindle in Nora's expression. The Wilsons might listen. "Mrs. Wilson told me just last week how proud she was of Tommy's progress." "Start there," Luis nodded. "I'll speak with the Jenkins family. Mr. Jenkins may act gruff, but he dotes on Sarah and the mercantile owner. He's seen how many families come to town now, bringing trade because of the school." Nora straightened her shoulders, squaring them as if preparing for a challenge. "When should we begin?" "Now," Luis said firmly. "We'll need everyone's support by Sunday service. That's when we make our stand." "Sunday?" Nora's eyes widened. "But Haldridge always attends service. He makes sure everyone sees him in the front pew, acting pious." "Exactly." Luis's mouth set in a grim line. "Let him see the whole town united against his schemes. Let him know we won't be bullied into giving up our children's future." They spent the morning planning their approach. Nora gathered her teaching records, proof of each child's progress. Luis drew on his knowledge of the townspeople, suggesting which families might be most receptive to their cause. As the sun climbed higher, they set out together. Their first stop was the Wilson farm, where Mrs. Wilson listened intently as Tommy proudly read from his primer. Her eyes grew misty as Nora explained how the railroad's plans would end such opportunities for advancement. "My boy deserves more than just following a plow," Mrs. Wilson declared, her work-worn hands clenching. "Count us in." The Jenkins family proved equally supportive. Mr. Jenkins, usually so taciturn, grew animated as Sarah showed him her writing practice. "Ain't right," he growled. Burning down a school. Ain't Christian at all. By sunset, they had visited 6 families. 4 had pledged their support outright. The other 2 wanted time to think, but Luis saw the spark of conviction in their eyes when their children spoke of what they'd learned. The next day brought more allies. The mercantile owner, calculating the increased trade the school brought, offered to help fund rebuilding. The blacksmith, whose daughter dreamed of becoming a teacher herself, promised to speak with other craftsmen. Word spread through town. Women gathered after church meetings to discuss the situation. Men talked in low voices outside the saloon. Children asked anxiously when their lessons would resume. Holdridge's men watched these developments with growing unease. They reported back to their boss, who responded with threats of economic consequences. But this time, the threats rang hollow against the tide of community solidarity. By Friday evening, nearly every family in town had aligned themselves with Nora's cause. Even those who had once mocked her size or questioned her methods now spoke of her with respect. They saw how she had transformed their children's futures, how she had brought hope to their small community. Luis watched this transformation with quiet pride. He had known from that first night he found her in the snow that Nora possessed extraordinary strength. Now others were finally seeing it too. Saturday evening found them in the small church preparing for the next day's confrontation. They had arranged for several parents to speak during the service, testifying to the school's importance. The children would sing hymns they had learned under Nora's guidance. As sunset painted the church windows in amber light, Luis and Nora knelt together in prayer. The empty sanctuary wrapped them in peaceful silence. "Lord," Nora prayed softly, "give us strength for tomorrow. Help us speak truth to power. Protect these precious children and their dreams." Luis's deep voice joined hers. "Guide us in your wisdom. Let justice prevail over greed. Show us the path through this trial." Their prayers mingled in the golden light. When they finished, neither moved immediately. A profound sense of peace had settled over them both. "Are you afraid?" Nora asked quietly. Luis considered the question honestly. "Not of Holdridge," he answered. "Only of failing those who trust us." Nora reached for his hand. "We won't fail," she said with quiet certainty. "God didn't bring us all together just to see us fall." Luis's fingers tightened around hers. He marveled at how far they had come. From that desperate night in the blizzard to this moment of shared purpose and deep trust. Looking at Nora now, he saw not just the determined teacher or the wounded soul who had needed his help, but a woman of remarkable courage and compassion, someone who had awakened his heart to love again. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said softly, "I'm grateful God led me to you that night." Nora's eyes shimmered with tears, but her smile was radiant. "He led us both where we needed to be." They remained in the church until twilight deepened into dusk, drawing strength from each other's presence and their shared faith. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, but tonight they were exactly where they belonged. Together, preparing to defend what was right, surrounded by a community united in purpose and hope. Sunday morning broke over the town like a promise, sunlight glinting off fresh snow. The church bell rang clear and sweet across the valley as families filed into the whitewashed building, their Sunday best brushed clean and pressed. Nora smoothed her dark wool dress with trembling hands as she took her usual seat. Luis slipped in quietly, standing at the back, his clean shirt stark against his weathered face. The congregation's murmurs fell silent as Holdridge strode down the center aisle, 2 burly men flanking him. His smirk spoke of absolute confidence as he claimed his customary front pew. When the hymns ended, Nora rose slowly. Her voice quavered at first but grew stronger with each word. "I came to this town carrying shame about who I was," she admitted. "But God showed me my true purpose, to help our children grow in knowledge and dignity." Luis stepped forward then, his tall frame drawing every eye. "I stand with Miss Bowers," he declared. "These children deserve better than a future bought with threats." One by one, townspeople stood. Mrs. Wilson clutched Tommy's hand as she rose. Mr. Jenkins, Sarah perched on his shoulders, joined them. The mercantile owner, the blacksmith and his daughter, until nearly every soul in the church was standing. Holdridge surged to his feet, face mottled. "You'll regret this. Without the railroad, this town will die." The preacher himself stepped forward, Bible held high. "No, Mr. Haldridge. Without our children's future, that's when we'd truly die." United, the congregation moved forward. Haldridge and his men backed away, their power crumbling before the town's resolve. They retreated across the churchyard, followed by the steady gazes of a community that would no longer bow to intimidation. Inside the church, hope blazed bright as sunlight through the windows. Nora and Louise stood shoulder to shoulder, surrounded by their neighbors, their hearts full of triumph and gratitude. In the bright weeks that followed, hope blossomed like spring flowers across the town. Farmer Jenkins donated a pristine acre of land beside the church, the deed signed with proud flourish. The ground, blessed by morning dew and evening prayers, soon echoed with the sounds of renewal. Children scampered between stacks of lumber carrying armfuls of books and precious slate tablets. Women gathered in sewing circles, their needles flashing as they crafted cheerful curtains from feed sacks. Men hefted axes and saws, the rhythm of their work punctuated by friendly banter. Luis moved among them like a quiet guardian, checking joints and teaching proper techniques. His gentle instructions earned nods of respect from even the most skeptical townsmen. The walls rose straight and true under his careful eye, stronger than before. Inside, Nora arranged desks with fresh enthusiasm. Her lesson plans filled page after page, dreams taking shape in neat rows of ink. Each evening, townsfolk gathered to share food and song. Hymns drifted across the twilight while lanterns cast warm pools of light. One starlit evening, as they walked from the nearly finished school, Luis stopped beneath a towering pine. His rough hands trembled as he turned to Nora. "I've been dreaming," he said softly. "Not just of you, but of us. Of mornings and evenings together, of building a life." He held out his calloused palm. "Would you share that dream with me?" Tears sparkled in Nora's eyes as she placed her hand in his. "Yes," she whispered. "Oh, yes." Lantern light transformed the new schoolhouse into a beacon of warmth against the evening sky. Fresh-cut pine boards glowed golden, and handmade curtains rustled in the breeze from open windows. Children lined up in their Sunday best eyes bright with excitement as they recited psalms in clear, strong voices. The townspeople packed the room shoulder to shoulder, their faces illuminated by dozens of glass lanterns. Hymns rose to the rafters, sweet and pure as morning light. Nora stood before them all, her heart so full it brought tears to her eyes. Luis shifted nervously at the edge of the crowd until Nora beckoned him forward. His boots scraped against the new floorboards as he made his way to her side. Taking a deep breath, he turned to face the gathering. "Months ago, I spoke words that came straight from my heart," he said, his voice steady despite his trembling hands. "I said I dream about a curvy woman like you, and God's shown me my dream is standing right here." A collective sigh of joy swept through the room. Women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs while men nodded approvingly. Nora's tears flowed freely as she placed her hand in Luis's weathered palm. The preacher stepped forward, raising his hands in blessing over them both. The community's voices joined as one in prayer and celebration. Later, walking home beneath the stars, their joined hands swung gently between them. Behind them, the schoolhouse glowed like a lantern of hope, its light marking the path they would walk together. Spring painted the valley in shades of new green, dotting meadows with purple wildflowers and yellow dandelions. The schoolhouse windows stood wide open, letting in fresh mountain air along with the sound of children's voices raised in song and recitation. Nora moved among the wooden desks with grace, her steps light and sure. Gone was the hesitation that had once clouded her eyes. Now she guided her students with gentle confidence, her smile brightening the room more than sunshine. Outside, Luis's axe rang steady against pine logs. He paused often to help neighboring families, teaching young boys to split wood safely or carrying water for tired mothers. The townspeople had come to rely on his quiet strength as much as his willing hands. That afternoon, while the children played in the schoolyard, Luis appeared in the doorway. In his rough hands, he held a bouquet of fresh-picked columbines and Indian paintbrush. Nora's eyes softened at the sight. Together, they stood watching the children chase each other through new grass. "Look how far we've come," Nora whispered, leaning against his shoulder. Luis wrapped an arm around her waist. As long as there's breath in my body, I'll guard this dream of yours. Nora closed her eyes in silent prayer, thankful for second chances and restored faith. The setting sun painted the mountains gold and pink, its light spilling through the schoolhouse windows to wrap them in warmth. Around them, the sounds of children's laughter and townsfolk calling evening greetings filled the air, a community renewed by love and trust in God's greater plan. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.